All right, we're going to look at Peter Singer's Rethinking Life and Death, or at least some key chapters from it, which I had you read. Let me give you some background in the chapters that I didn't have you read. A major change regarding the criterion of death in the 20th century happened, according to Singer's telling, because of two developments. So, as you know, the criterion of death, I believe it's still the case, in the United States and most Western countries, is death of the whole brain. It is not, as it used to be in previous centuries, just bodily death. So, for example, the criterion of death, the test for death in previous centuries would be, is the person still breathing? I mean, literally, they put a mirror in front of somebody's mouth, and if the mirror mists up, then the person is alive, and if not, the person is dead. So this is bodily death. So why did it change so that the official criterion of death became whole brain death? Well, this happened because, first of all, the first change that facilitated this move from bodily death to brain death was the invention of artificial respirators. And this happened because of the polio epidemic that they had in the early 20th century. My uncle died of polio, and he was born in the 40s. He was 6 when he died of it. So it was a terrible epidemic that sort of swept over the world. And one of the things with polio is that you go through a stage where you're paralyzed, and because you're paralyzed, you're unable to breathe. Now, I understand that this passes, and if you can get through this stage, you can survive. I mean, as we know, it affects different people differently. For example, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had polio, and that's why he had to use a wheelchair. So it can affect people permanently, but apparently this paralysis that stops you being able to breathe passes. But of course, if you die during this paralysis because you can't breathe, it doesn't help you that you would have come out of it because it's too late. So in order to keep kids alive while they're paralyzed, they had to have air pumped into their lungs. And in the early days, this was done by hand. You would have nurses literally squeezing bellows to force air into kids' lungs. And this was obviously unsustainable. You can't have that many. There just weren't enough nurses to keep kids alive. So this led to the invention of an artificial respirator, just literally a machine that would pump air into kids' lungs. And this is the first artificial respirator. Now, of course, we're very familiar with these, but this was a 20th century invention. But what they discovered, of course, is that once you have these machines, they can keep people alive, not just obviously alert, temporarily paralyzed polio sufferers, but people whose cortex had been destroyed. Because in the old days, those people would just die because their body wouldn't handle respiration, and they would just die. But once you have artificial respirators, these people can be kept alive, and perhaps indefinitely. Of course, they have to be fed through a drip as well, but you have machines breathing for them, you have machines feeding them, they can be kept alive. So once the invention of the respirator led to this phenomenon of wards in hospitals filling up with people in what we now call persistent vegetative states. That is, the part of the brain, the cortex, that is responsible for consciousness, awareness, ability to feel pain, ability to think, that's gone, either through a brain bleed or an accident or whatever. That's been destroyed, but you can keep the body alive, possibly for years and years. And because of the old standard that you cannot allow people to die I mean, if these people are alive, their bodies are alive by the old standard. They passed the breath test, I assume. Well, certainly they have a pulse. They can pass that test. You can't let them die. That's not what hospitals are supposed to do. So they had wards that gradually were filling up with these patients who would remain in a coma, unresponsive, for the rest of their bodily life, and maybe live for decades and decades and never have another thought or experience. And this was as a result of technology, an advance in technology. Before, these people would have just died because their bodies couldn't keep them alive, couldn't handle respiration. But now you had artificial means, so they were kept alive. That was the one advance. The other advance was the first heart transplant. This was performed by a guy called Christian Barnard, a South African surgeon. And the first successful heart transplant, he only lived like a couple of weeks, maybe even less than that. But it was successful in that respect. He was able to take a heart out of one person and put it into another, and the person who received it was able to survive for a few days at least. And of course, heart transplants have gotten better and better ever since. So, now, why is this relevant? Well, unlike other organs like kidneys, lungs, livers, organs like that, you cannot store a heart and have it be useful. You cannot pack it in ice and freeze it. Literally, the heart, to be useful, a heart that you receive in a transplant has to have been beating very shortly previously. So you can't store them. So where do we get the hearts that we need to do heart? Now we can do heart transplants. We need hearts. And we need hearts that have been alive until very recently. So either you sort of hope for a massive car accident outside the hospital, or a few blocks away, so that people die, but they die close enough to the hospital so that you can quickly remove their hearts and put them in patients. Or, hey, look, we have these wards full of people whose brain will never work again, and they're being kept alive on respirators, and they're kind of filling up the hospital. Wouldn't they be good sources of beating hearts? Because, of course, there's nothing wrong with their hearts. It's their brains that are destroyed. And this kind of, hey, kill two birds with one stone thinking was essentially the reason for the change from the bodily criterion of death to the brain death criterion. Now, this has become accepted practice. And this is one of the things, the first changes that Singer points out has already happened to what he calls the old ethic. And he summarizes in the last chapter of the book the old ethic, the old view. This is the sanctity of life view. So, according to this, all life is sacred, or at least all human life is sacred. He wants to replace it with what you might call the quality of life view. And he claims that this has already happened to a degree. He makes a good analogy at the beginning of the last chapter between this switch from the old sanctity of life view to what he thinks we've already made the move to most of these principles. It's just we won't admit it to ourselves. He thinks that this view is already broken and unsustainable. People don't really believe it. They just tell themselves they believe it. Now, of course, some people believe it. If you're a committed Catholic, for example, you really hold fast to these principles. And with what Singer regards as terrible consequences, like Dr. Shen's dilemma, which we'll get to in a little bit. But he says this is like what happened with the view of the solar system, or the view of the universe. The old view of the universe, dating back to an ancient Greek called Ptolemy, is that the Earth is the center of the universe and everything rotates around it. And this view was very acceptable to later thinkers, particularly influenced by religion, because having the Earth be the center of the universe makes sense if you're a Christian or a Muslim, and you regard the Earth as God's most important project and us as God's most important creation. It would make sense that the entire universe is for us. Basically, we're the point of the universe, so we should be the center of the universe and everything rotates around it. Of course, what we now know is that we're off in some dusty corner of the universe. We're unbelievably insignificant. Now, of course, this piece of knowledge, this fact, has been talked about in other sections in this class. This acknowledgement that we're incredibly insignificant on the grand scheme of things can make you question the meaning of life. Susan Wolf's article talks about this, that we've got to understand this fact about our lives before we can make the step to finding meaning in our lives. But anyway, that is what modern science accepts. But there had to be a leap, at which point the old view was abandoned, and the new view that Copernicus suggested, at least for the solar system, is that the sun is the center of the solar system and all the planets, of which we are just one, rotate around the sun. Now, probably you're familiar with the story of Galileo. Galileo believed the Copernicus system and wrote books about it and did experiments, and Galileo produced a very good telescope and was able to make discoveries that seemed to threaten the Copernican view. Another feature of the Copernican view, influenced by Aristotle, is that all of the planets are perfect spheres. And what Galileo noticed is that the moon has giant craters on it. I mean, that's actually visible to the naked eye, so you wonder why this hadn't been noticed before. Which itself was a threat to the standard view that was endorsed by the Catholic Church of the universe. So Galileo was brought before the Pope and told to recant, to basically say, I was kidding, Ptolemy is right. And, other people like Giordano Bruno had been burned at the stake for not doing this. So Galileo very wisely says, no, that whole us at the center of the universe, yeah, that's the one, that's true. The story goes that as he kissed the ground in front of the Pope, he said, and yet it moves, meaning that it rotates around the sun. And he was still imprisoned, but at least he wasn't burnt at the stake. Okay, so what Singer is using as an analogy is that the Copernican view was actually a great view. It made sense of what we observed. It explained a lot of the phenomena in the early days. But the more we discovered about the universe, the more that technology advances, the better measurements we were able to take, the better stargazing equipment we got, the more the view was threatened. The more we discovered things that didn't seem to fit with this idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. Now, clever people who were committed to the old view made adjustments to it, but they became more and more desperate adjustments. So, for example, this is a silly adjustment, but when Galileo noticed that there were craters on the moon, which threatened this idea that the celestial bodies were perfect spheres, a defender of the old view said, okay, yeah, maybe they look like craters, but they're still perfect spheres because the craters are filled with invisible stuff. So that makes the moon is still a perfect sphere. It just appears not to be. This is obviously a ridiculous claim. The sole point of making this claim is to try and save the old view that the moon is a perfect sphere. That's the only reason you would say this, not because it's a sensible claim. And this ties in with a lot of claims that are made in medicine that are sort of half acknowledge that the old view is ridiculous, but try to save it. So, for example, we don't want to abandon the idea that we treat all human life as of equal worth, and yet here we are taking these hearts from people who are alive by the old standard so that they can be transplanted into other people. So clearly, we don't value the life of the donors. We don't value the life of the people that we're taking their hearts from them to give to somebody else. Clearly, we prefer the person we're giving the heart to, because we're killing this person to save this person. How is that consistent with this old commandment? And the only way to try and make it consistent is to claim that the person we're taking the heart from is actually dead. Because if they're actually dead, then we're not breaking this rule. We say, oh, we treat all human life of equal worth. It's just that these people are dead. So we're not violating this principle by taking a heart from this person because they're dead. And what Singer points out is that's insane. They're pink, they're breathing. You wouldn't put somebody like that in a coffin, right? That would be crazy. So clearly, and he cites examples of, like, we actually use this language at the same time. We say that they're brain dead, and we say that they're being kept alive by a respirator. How can they be dead if they're being kept alive? Well, they're brain dead, okay, but they're still alive. They are alive. Now, so in the case of Dr. Shan's dilemma, the trouble is, so let's briefly describe Dr. Shan's dilemma. This was Dr. Shan was a pediatric surgeon in an Australian hospital, because Singer is Australian. He's now based at Princeton, but he comes from Australia. And Dr. Shan was faced with this dilemma. A child was born anencephalic. Now, anencephalic means, as you probably already know if you've read it, without a brain, or at least without the cortex of your brain. And these are not very rare births, but they're rare, but they're not incredibly rare. What will happen is that the brain doesn't form properly. And typically what happens is they still have the brain stem. Now, if you have the brain stem, this is not responsible for consciousness. You will never have a thought. You will never feel anything. You will never feel pain. But the brain stem does regulate all kinds of things. So, for example, if you just have a working brain stem, you can still kind of flinch. You can still react to things. Your pulse will quicken, as he says, if you're cut open to have your heart removed. So anencephalic children muscles can twitch. It can look like they're smiling. It can look like all kinds of things are going on. But literally, with some of them, if you hold a flashlight in one ear, you can see the light coming out of the other ear, because there's nothing there. It's either, some of them are born so that literally their head ends here, and that it's just kind of flat with no skull forms and just sort of smooth skin across the top. Or some are born with normally formed heads. It's just, instead of where their cortex is, it's just fluid. That's why you can see light passing through it. So this happens. Anencephaly is a condition. It's when abortion is legal, very few anencephalic babies are born because it's detectable on an ultrasound. You can see that the fetus is anencephalic. Now, of course, it has to reach a certain level of development. So probably third trimester is when you can tell that the baby is, the fetus is anencephalic. And a lot of mothers, probably the majority, would choose not to take it to term because the baby can't survive except on a respirator and will never have a thought, will never have a feeling, will never have an emotion because they don't have the equipment. Okay, so Dr. Shan's dilemma was he had one child was born apparently healthy except with heart disease, basically a faulty heart, and kept having cardiac arrests and having to be revived. And he knew that it was going to die soon. But otherwise, you know, healthy baby, alert, brain works fine. And then at the same time, he had, in the same ward, an anencephalic baby who was a tissue match. So here would seem to be a case where you could take the heart from the anencephalic baby and give it to the baby with the faulty heart, if you were allowed to do that. But remember, even though they changed the criterion from bodily death to brain death, they changed it to whole brain death. And the anencephalic baby has a working brain stem. There is activity going on in the brain stem. So it doesn't meet the criterion of whole brain death. Now, it's actually the case that probably most of the donors for hearts don't meet this standard either. So there's a lot of, apparently, murder by the old standard going on in hospitals already. This is one of Singer's points. He's saying, look, a lot of the practice in hospitals already violates these principles. If you really enforce these principles, you wouldn't be able to practice medicine as we've been practicing it. And in fact, in one of the other chapters, he recounts how in the Reagan era, they really clamped down and they tried to follow these and basically gave up because doctors pushed back and it just wasn't workable. All right, so Dr. Shan was not allowed to remove the heart, and as a result, both babies died. The anencephalic baby died because they die. They can't, their brain, you can't live that long without a brain. Sometimes you can live a surprisingly long time, as for example, a mother of an anencephalic child he describes who was very religious, insisted, against what the doctors wanted to do, insisted and got a court order insisting that her baby be kept alive as long as possible. And they can be alive for a year or two. If you keep them on respirators, you know, and artificial, and on a drip and so on. But normally the parents of anencephalic babies are willing to give them up for organ donation. And in fact, another case described by Singer is a mother who wanted to do that, discovered in about the third trimester that the child she was bearing was going to be anencephalic, and said, I will take it to term so that it can be an organ donor. I won't abort it. I will take it to term so that the organs can be used. And they weren't allowed to be used for this reason, because it would have required killing the child. Now, Dr. Shan said, because of these rules, both babies died. I could have saved one of them. We should change the rules. There were three possibilities. One was to say that the old system was right, that the baby, the anencephalic baby is alive and can't be an organ donor. And there were people at the conference that Singer describes who agreed with that. The second view was Dr. Shan's. He said that we should redefine death from whole brain death to death of the cortex. Now this view, you can see, is kind of consistent with, if we go way back to early in the class when we were talking about what am I. There's a view, one view, that dates back to Locke, that I am most essentially a person. And what it is to be a person is to be conscious. Now the weird thing about this view that Locke acknowledged is that I, as a person, start to exist probably after birth. And because that's how far back you can date my consciousness. Certainly I wasn't an early fetus because I didn't have a brain then, so it wasn't, well, I didn't have. The thing that existed wasn't me because it didn't have a brain. So persons are not just conscious, they're self-conscious, which is why a newborn baby isn't really a person because it isn't capable of self-consciousness yet. Now, if we are persons, then this new criterion that Dr. Shan is suggesting, this new criterion of death, that it be death of the cortex means the end of me, that makes perfect sense. Because when my consciousness is over, I cease to exist as a person. There's still a body here, but unless you're what we call back in that unit animalists, who say that I am a human body and that if you take away my brain, it's still me, if you don't agree with that view, if you're a personalist, then if my cortex dies, then I die with it. Singer didn't take that view. Singer took the third view, and he said, look, it doesn't make sense to say that the anencephalic baby was born dead. It was born alive, it was breathing, it was pink, it was supple, it had a pulse. But, he says, it's not dead, but that doesn't mean we can't take its organs. The only reason we want to redefine death is because we want to cling to this old commandment. So we want to take the organs, and we say, we want to take the organs, but if we can't do it if the baby is alive, so let's call it dead. And what Singer is saying is, see what you're forced to, see what mental gymnastics you're forced into by trying to cling to these old principles. Instead, you should move to new principles and recognize that the worth of human life varies. Say, the anencephalic baby is alive, but its life is of no value to it. So it can be killed for the good of the child with the intact brain but the damaged heart, because that life is more valuable. Because it is a life that can mean something to the person that has it because they are capable of consciousness. So this example of trying to play with the definition of death to allow us to do things that we know make sense. We know that it makes sense to take the heart from the anencephalic baby and give it to the other baby. But it violates this rule. What should we do? Singer says, get rid of that rule, switch to this one. Otherwise, you're forced into just kind of strange contortions and fictional claims, like claiming that a pink, breathing baby is dead when it clearly isn't. That's an example like claiming that the moon is a perfect sphere, even though we can see craters on it. It's something that you're forced to do if you're clinging desperately to an outmoded view. Another example is this distinction between extraordinary and ordinary treatment. When people are, it is legal to take people off life support. You're allowed to do that. Why are you allowed to do that when you're clearly causing the death of somebody? You're causing the end of a human life. How is it allowed to do that? Well, the fig leaf that allows this is to claim that that a respirator is extraordinary treatment, and you don't have to prolong extraordinary treatment. You do have to prolong ordinary treatment, but you're not allowed to. But you're allowed to cease extraordinary treatment. And what Singer points out is, but the same treatment counts as extraordinary for somebody who's brain dead whereas it would be ordinary for somebody for a polio child. So we've got this rule of thumb that says, well, we don't have to prolong life using extraordinary treatment. And this allows us to do what we clearly think is appropriate, which is take brain dead people off respirators. So to enable us to do something that we obviously see, that the vast majority of us see makes total sense, take brain dead people off respirators, we claim that respirators for brain dead people are extraordinary treatment. And there's this rule, you don't have to take extraordinary measures to keep someone alive. But as Singer points out, a respirator is not extraordinary treatment if you are temporarily paralyzed, so like the polio kids that it was invented for. So suppose a kid is on a respirator and they're temporarily paralyzed and the respirator is going to get them through this. You're not allowed to say, well, it's a respirator, so it's extraordinary treatment, so we could just turn it off and kill the kid. No, then the respirator is ordinary treatment. And he says, why is the same thing, a respirator, extraordinary treatment, and therefore not really necessary in this case, but obviously vital treatment and totally necessary, and you can't stop it in the polio kid case? Answer, because we recognize that the value of life when you're brain dead is not important enough to keep alive. Whereas a child that has a future ahead of them and is conscious and aware, you've got to save them. So this extraordinary-ordinary distinction is an attempt to hide the fact that we're already actually doing this. No, no, say the sanctity of life people. Because actually, if you read the article I also gave you, which is a Catholic response to Singer, although I say response, he seems to kind of ignore Singer and just talk about the Singer in his mind. A lot of the things he says about Singer I don't think are accurate portrayals. But he says, of course, you don't have to prolong life beyond, when it's ridiculous. You don't have to take extraordinary measures. And Singer says, exactly, but this is only true when the life is of no value, either because they're brain dead or because the person no longer wants to live. And he says, what happened in England is an acknowledgement of this. And that's the case of Anthony Bland, the kid who got crushed at the Hillsborough stadium disaster, where all of these Liverpool fans were crushed against the fence, and oxygen was starved to his brain and he was brain dead. And the law lords, which, it's England, so we have all these lords, Sir so-and-so and Lord such-and-such. I mean, the names are Lord Gough of Cheveley was my favorite. There's some great names there, but basically that's the English equivalent of the Supreme Court here. And they made the decision that you could take Tony Bland off life support because his life was not of value to him. So this little Venn diagram is relevant to the Singer talks about, when Singer talks about persons, he means persons in the sense that Locke means. And this Venn diagram represents the fact that while there is a huge overlap between humans and persons, and you, me, everybody watching this video falls in here, I assume, unless you're aliens in disguise, but I assume you're all humans and you're all persons because you're all conscious and self-aware. So we are very familiar with this overlap. But there are persons who are not humans. Now, this depends on your definition of persons. It might be that, in fact, on Earth, if your definition of person is strict enough, only human beings can meet that level. However, it seems pretty likely that someone like Coco the gorilla, who is capable of sign language and can communicate, a hundreds of words, it seems pretty likely that she meets the level of any reasonable definition of person. If you want to count toddlers as persons, she's probably at their level. So if toddlers are included here in the person circle, obviously toddlers are in the human circle, but if they're also included in the person circle, then Coco should probably be included in the person circle as well. So who are the humans who are outside of the person circle? Anencephalic babies, Tony Bland, early fetuses, anybody whose brain has been starved of oxygen so that their cortex ceases to function irreparably. Terry Shiver was a famous example from the George W. Bush presidency. There was a huge fuss about Terry Shiver. Look it up. So when he talks about persons, he means to include potentially non-humans, but also not include all humans. Whereas the Old Commandment says, treat all human life as always more precious than any non-human life. Now, persons, one of the innovations that Locke made was to say that it was the person that was valuable. That if there is such a thing as a rights bearer, something that has rights, it should be based on your person status, not on your biological status. Whereas the Old Commandments say, if you have human DNA, then you get to have rights, even if you have no working cortex. This is the obvious assumption as well in anti-abortion laws that start very early. You know, for example, they're changing the laws all over the place to 6 weeks. 6 weeks, there is no developed brain there. There certainly isn't a cortex capable of consciousness. So what they're saying is that if a 6-week fetus is of equal moral value to an adult human, it can only be because they're human. Because you can have a 6-week human fetus. It would take a very clever person to distinguish that from a 6-week gorilla fetus. Certainly in terms of capabilities, there's no difference. No, one isn't having deep thoughts while the other one is just going ooh, ooh. That neither of them are having deep thoughts. And certainly an adult gorilla is leagues more sophisticated than a 6-week-old fetus. So what Singer says is, look, whether or not we value your life and whether or not you have rights is dependent on whether you are capable of certain things. So an anencephalic baby, even though it's undeniably human, its life is of no value to it because it doesn't have a functioning cortex. And obviously, we can't rip it out of the arms of the mother and say, okay, organ donation for this one, because it's still her child. She gets to decide what happens to it. But if, as in the cases of parents who wanted to do this, if she wants to donate the organs of her child to save another child, then she should be able to make that decision, says Singer in his New Commandments. Whereas the old ones, you know, according to the old ones, that would be like my mother, who's still alive in her 80s, God bless her, deciding to donate my organs. Obviously, she can't do that, but it would be on the same level. A mother deciding to donate her anencephalic child's heart would be as bad as my mother right now deciding to donate my heart while I'm still using it. Singer says, nobody really thinks that, do they? This is what we really believe. We just don't want to give up on these because they sound worthy. They sound wonderful. Treat all human life as of equal worth. That is obviously sounds wonderful. That is the kind of principle that led to the toppling of divine right of kings that, you know, is behind the civil rights movement. Clearly this is a great principle, except modern technology has shown its limitations. This would be still perfect if we were living in the Middle Ages, because we wouldn't be faced with decisions of being able to keep alive anencephalic babies. They would just die. There would be no respirators keeping Tony Bland alive indefinitely. He would just die. So we never had to make these decisions in the old days. But now we do. We should acknowledge that these are the new ones. That's what he claims. Now, where he gets controversial, Singer is a controversial figure. He gets boycotted. He describes in the book a case where his view meant that a conference he was going to attend in Germany was going to be picketed to such an extent that they just cancelled it because his views leaked out. And where he gets, I think, most controversial, and rightly so, is where he talks about young babies, and possibly young babies, his suggestion with a co-author called Helga Kuser, that up to 28 days after the birth of a baby, you can decide to have it die, if there are good reasons for doing so, and if there's nobody who wants to accept it. So, for example, he says, Down syndrome children, if there's nobody who wants to adopt the Down syndrome child, they can be allowed to die, or they can be given a lethal injection. Now, this sounds very heartless, but it turns out Down syndrome children have been allowed to die on a regular basis legally. This is one of the things that's discussed in the chapters I didn't have you read. It turns out that Down syndrome babies, a common comorbid condition with Down syndrome is to have a blockage in the esophagus. That means that you can't eat food. And so, of course, you will starve to death. Now, if the child were not Down syndrome, and if it had this blockage, there would be no question that a fairly straightforward surgery would be performed to remove the blockage. It wouldn't even be, it would be like, kids being born with a cleft palate or something like that. They get operated on, no problem. But this condition has been used to justify allowing Down syndrome babies to starve to death. Because again, now Down syndrome babies, well, actually I say now, I said maybe when Singer was writing this in the 90s and Roe versus Wade was still in effect, a lot of Down syndrome babies were detected and aborted because the parents didn't want to raise a Down syndrome child. Of course, some parents do. And of course, people with Downs are persons. There is no question that the vast majority of people with Downs are clear persons. They're capable of language, they're capable of acting, they're capable of doing all kinds of things. But most parents, if they were asked, would you choose to have a Down syndrome child, would say no. Or at least would think no if they didn't think saying it was appropriate. And in the old days, there was no test for Downs. There is now. It turns out it's a very easily detectable genetic condition, and so you can have an amnio and test for Downs. But in the old days, it wasn't. So you would find out your child was Downs when it was born. And he describes cases where, an English case where a mother discovered her baby was Downs, and she said, I don't want it. And the hospital would deal with it. And in the case of where it had this blockage, they say, well, removing the blockage would be extraordinary treatment, so we don't have to do it, so we just allow the baby we just keep the baby comfortable, but we don't remove the blockage, therefore it can't eat, therefore it will die in a week. Now, this is so that we appear not to be violating these. What Singer says is, look, either the baby is valuable, and in which case, remove the blockage. You're not allowed to leave the blockage in. You treat the baby as you would a non-Downs baby, and you remove the blockage. Or, if you're allowed to decide, we don't want this child to live because it's Downs, don't let it die slowly by starvation. Give it a lethal injection. So recognize that you're making this decision and take responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. If you're deciding that a Down's baby should be allowed to die because nobody wants it, then be merciful and kill it quickly. But what you shouldn't do is pretend that you're valuing all life equally. It's just that this child, it would require extraordinary care. So obviously we can't kill it because you're never intentionally allowed to take innocent human life, but you can allow it to die. That's horrific, he says. If you're going to decide that this child should die, kill it quickly and painlessly. Take responsibility for the consequence of your action is death either way. Make it quick. If that is what you admit that you want this child to die, make it quick. And another case where this comes up is a woman, Lillian Boyes, who had horrific rheumatoid arthritis. She was quite old, but she had horrific rheumatoid arthritis to the extent that she would howl like a dog if you touched her because she was in such pain. Her doctor gave her a lethal dose of pain medication and was put on trial for killing her. And obviously he did it out of mercy. Clearly he intended to kill her, but what the law decided in that case was that his intention was to relieve pain, and it was just unfortunate that she died as a result of it. Again, this is just fiction, says Singer. Everybody knows he intended to kill her. But what everyone also agrees was that it was okay that he intended to kill her because she wanted to die, and it is not bad. But we don't want to admit that we're violating this old commandment. So we claim, oh, he didn't intentionally do that. Singer says, that's bullshit. Admit what's going on. Admit that it's okay sometimes to cause, you respect a person's desire to live or die. This should allow assisted suicide. As we now have in some as we have in various European countries, most notably Holland, and some states like Oregon where you can get a lethal prescription. So we've already made this transition in many cases. Bring children into the world only if they're wanted versus be fruitful and multiply. The Catholic position, of course, is opposed even to contraception. That is against what most people in America believe. But notice, Singer wrote all this in the 90s. If anything, in recent years, we've kind of, people defending this old ethic have gotten more effective. Most of the Supreme Court seems to be committed to this. And an old law that Singer actually mentions from the 19th century, the Comstock Law, which used anti-obscenity laws to ban the movement of contraceptives from state to state. So if you sent contraceptives in the mail, you violate the Comstock Law and you could be put in prison. This was anti-contraceptive law. And this law is still on the books. And in fact, it just wasn't enforced. It was regarded as one of those old laws that didn't need to be repealed. It was just outdated because nobody enforced it. But the conservative movement responsible for repealing Roe versus Wade is talking about using the Comstock Law to prevent the abortion pill being sent through the mail. They want to get rid of the use of abortion pill federally. So even states like Massachusetts or Michigan, where abortion is illegal, you won't be able to get the abortion pill sent to you by using the Comstock Law. This is a law that we thought was ridiculous in the 20s, but it's in the 1920s, not the 2020s, and yet it's being used. And it's committed to this idea that contraception is wrong. There's an old joke There is a biblical figure, a person in the Bible called Onan, not Conan, Onan. If you don't know who this is, shame on you for not knowing your Bible. Another term for masturbation is onanism. Why? Because Onan is the most famous masturbator ever. He is a character in the Bible who spilled his seed upon the ground, obviously to avoid conceiving. So he made sure that his semen was disposed of rather than resulting in children. There's an old joke. Granny, why do you call your pet budgerigar Onan? Because he spills his seed on the ground. Yeah, I didn't say it was a funny joke. But Onan is a figure in the Bible that is pointed to as doing something bad because he's not following this commandment. What Singer says is that's ridiculous. And it's kind of scary that when Singer was writing in the 90s, I remember the 90s, it was a good decade, there were 5 billion people. And he said, this is unsustainable. Well, we've passed 8 billion. And, things are getting from bad to worse pretty quickly. So he says this is clearly a more sensible principle. Now, another area Singer causes controversy is when he's opposed to speciesism. That is, he says what matters is persons, not humans as humans. Obviously, most humans matter because they're persons, but non-human persons should be treated equally to human persons. If E.T. was alive, if E.T. existed, killing him would be just as much murder as killing me, because we're both persons. We both have the capabilities that make us morally valuable. Singer, actually, the first thing that Singer was famous for is a book called Animal Liberation that he wrote in the 1970s, arguing against mistreatment of animals. He's a long-standing vegetarian and so on. So it seems odd that he is in favor of allowing most abortions, and yet he wouldn't eat meat. But he is perfectly consistent, because what he says is, the reason you can have an abortion is not because the fetus is of no value. He says you should never cause pain. Even non-persons can be capable of experiencing pain. Some non-persons can't. Anthony Bland, anencephalic babies, they can't feel pain. Okay, so they're at an even lower level of creatures like a rabbit or a fish who can feel pain. They're just not persons. They're not self-conscious. But he says, so we don't have to perhaps respect their right to life because they don't have an interest in life. They, like a fish, doesn't have a conception of its plans for its future. That makes it wrong to kill it. As George Pitcher, if we go back to the section on death, says that you can harm the dead, you can harm people by thwarting their desires. So one way to understand that is the harm of killing someone is putting an end to their desires and ensuring that their plans for the future aren't realized. Clearly, a fish doesn't have plans for the future, so you can't harm them in the same way that you can a person. But they do have an interest in not feeling pain. So Singer would say that it's actually worse to cause an animal to suffer than to kill it. And of course, most of us believe that because that's why we euthanize our pets when they suffer. And he says even persons can be in that situation too. When you're old, you can see no future for yourself that isn't in agony, so you get to make the decision whether or not you live or die. So, this actually, yeah, let's talk about, he says there are two main, the two central assumptions of the old ethic that Singer rejects. He does this in the last section of the last chapter. Because they are untenable, he claims. The first one is we are responsible for what we intentionally do in a way that we are not for what we deliberately fail to prevent. This is the acts and omissions distinction. This enables us to allow passive euthanasia, like allowing people to die, but not active euthanasia. Singer says, no. If the end result that you want is death, then it's stupid and cruel to say that we're allowed to achieve this by letting, say, for example, the Down syndrome child starve to death, or letting somebody on a... For example, you can take people off a respirator, but you can't take them off a feeding tube. And some people actually survive. There was a case of somebody who was brain dead, and they thought they would die when they took them off the respirator, but actually their brain stem was enough that it regulated their breathing, and they stayed alive for a decade. So they weren't allowed to cause the death of someone that they were intending to cause the death of, because they weren't allowed to literally directly cause the death. What he says is, if what you intend is the death, then it makes no moral difference whether or not you allow it or you cause it directly through an overdose of painkillers or something. Neither is worse than the other, except maybe actually passive euthanasia is worse because it takes longer. It's not worse for someone who's brain dead because they can't suffer, but why take longer when you're trying to achieve the result of death? Make it quick. So that's the other thing. There's no morally relevant difference between acts and omissions if you're doing both to achieve the same result. The second central assumption of the old ethic that Singer rejects, the lives and all and only members of our species are more worthy of protecting than any other being. As he says, it's kind of ironic that the pro-life movement calls itself pro-life. Are they really vegetarians? Obviously not. So they're saying that a blob of cells, like if you say, people who say abortion is murder from conception, they're saying that a blob of cells that's so small it can't be seen from the naked eye is of vastly more worth than a whale. Or, you can kill a whale, but you can't kill the blob. You can kill Coco and use her hands as ashtrays, as people used to do and still do with gorillas. That's fine. You've done nothing wrong there, but you can't destroy a blob of human cells because they're human. He says, I reject that. There is nothing intrinsically valuable about human DNA. What has value is capabilities like ability to feel pain. That, if you feel pain, then you have an interest in not feeling pain, and we have a moral duty to respect that. If you can think, we have a moral duty to respect that. But if you're just a blob of human DNA, we don't have a duty to respect that life. You have potential, but potential is not the same as actual. Like a 5-year-old has the potential to be a driver, but you don't say the 5-year-old has a right to drive. So a blob of human DNA, if the parents want that blob to develop into a baby, then obviously that is their right. But just in terms of intrinsic worth, that doesn't have value, whereas somebody who has the capabilities of a person does have value. That's Singer's view. What do you think?